The Washington Cascades, October 1923, 6:45 in the morning. Carl Haugen, 41, 11 years running donkey engines. A composite of the donkey punchers documented in Pacific Northwest Company records and published oral histories of this era, stands on the plank deck of a wood-fired yarding donkey, one hand on the friction lever, watching a steel main line run out into timber he cannot see. Somewhere down the slope, 400 feet away and below the crest of the hill, a choker setter is wrapping a cable around a Douglas fir log heavier than a loaded rail car. Haugen will never see the log until it arrives. He will pull it in anyway. That is the fact worth stopping on. The steam donkey was, by 1923, the most powerful machine in the American woods. A boiler, a steam engine, and winch drums bolted to a sled of logs, capable of dragging timber that no team of animals on Earth could move. And the man operating it worked blind. The log was over a rise, behind a stump field, buried in slash. Between Haugen's hand on the lever and the load at the end of his line, there was nothing but a whistle code, the feel of the machine under his feet, and 11 years of learning what a straining cable communicates through iron. The morning's first turn was the one he trusted least. The ground was wet from overnight rain. A log that had lain overnight settles into the mud, and a log stuck fast behaves differently on the line than a log that is moving. The drum labors, the main line rises off the ground and goes rigid, and the engineer has a short interval in which to decide whether the load is about to break free or the rigging is about to break instead. A steel cable parting under thousands of pounds of tension does not simply drop. It comes back. Every man on a rigging crew in 1923 knew what a snapped line could do, because the industry's own safety literature and the published memoirs of the men who survived the era, Andrew Mason Prouty would later title his history of Pacific Coast logging More Deadly Than War, documented it without decoration. So Haugen stood with his weight balanced, listening to the boiler, watching the line, waiting for 3 short blasts from a whistle operated by a boy he also could not see. 11 years had taught him what the manual could not, how a main line sounds when the log is coming, and how it sounds when something else is about to happen instead. But before any of that judgment mattered, a more basic question has to be answered. What exactly was this machine, and why, within 40 years of its invention, had every logging operation in the Pacific Northwest reorganized itself entirely around it? The machine under Carl Haugen's feet existed because of a problem that animals could not solve. Before 1881, a felled log in the Pacific Northwest moved one way, dragged by teams of oxen, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 or more, along skid roads paved with greased wooden ties. It was slow, it was expensive, and it had a hard boundary. Oxen could not work steep ground, could not work deep mud or ice, and tired like anything alive, which meant that for decades, logging in Washington and Oregon was effectively confined to a strip within a mile or two of water, where logs could be floated to a mill. The largest timber on the continent stood on slopes no animal could reach, and it might as well have been on the moon. In August 1881, John Dolbear, a partner in the Dolbear and Carson Lumber Company of Eureka, California, mounted a small single-cylinder steam engine and a vertical spool, a gypsy head, on a sled of logs, wrapped a manila rope around the spool, hitched the other end to a redwood log, and opened the throttle. The patent was issued the following April. The first machines were crude. The rope had to be hauled back out to the woods by a horse after every log. But the principle was decisive, and it improved fast. Manila rope became steel cable. A second drum was added to carry a haulback line, running through a block anchored to a stump, so the machine could return its own rigging without the horse. By the 1900s, donkeys pulled themselves across the landscape on their own sleds, winching from stump to stump. By the 1910s, the industry took the cables off the ground entirely. High-lead logging, with the main line running through a block hung near the top of a limbed and topped spar tree. By the 1920s, commonly 150 feet up, so that the front end of each log lifted clear of the stumps as it came in. A machine like Haugen's cost a company roughly $7,500, and with the right rigging it could bring in logs from up to a mile away. That is what the steam donkey provided. It made the slope itself irrelevant. Weather, terrain, distance from water, the boundaries that had defined 50 years of Northwest logging were repealed by a boiler on a sled. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American logging between 1900 and 1980. What the falling crew, the steam donkey, the logging railroad, or the river drive actually required. What the men running them had to know, and what the wood they cut actually became once it reached the mill. Not folklore about giant lumberjacks, the documented technical reality of a dangerous trade practiced by skilled men under real physical risk. A steam donkey could outpull 200 oxen, but it could not see the log it was dragging. Every ton of that pull was applied by one man's judgment, sight unseen, on the word of a whistle. And if someone in your family worked in the woods in this era, put it in the comments. Did anyone in your family run a donkey, set chokers, or pull a whistle wire in a Pacific Northwest camp? And did they ever tell you what a straining main line sounded like the moment before the engineer eased off? In a coming video, the whistle punk, the 12-year-old holding a wire that decided, several times an hour, whether grown men lived through the next turn, back to the woods. Because repealing the boundaries created a new problem the ox team never had. An ox driver walked beside his load. Haugen could not. His load was a quarter-mile away, out of sight, in the middle of a crew of men. How did a machine this powerful coordinate with the men working under its cables? The answer to how the machine coordinated with the men under its cables was a child. On most Pacific Northwest yarding operations of this era, the link between the rigging crew out in the slash and the engineer at the levers was the whistle punk, usually a boy, often in his early teens, frequently the youngest and newest person in the camp, stationed where he could see the choker setters, holding a thin wire that ran back to a steam whistle mounted on the donkey. When the chokers were set and the men were in the clear, the punk pulled his wire in the coded sequence, the whistle sounded at the landing, and Haugen opened the throttle on a load he could not see, on the word of a boy he could not see either. The codes themselves were serious enough that the industry standardized them. The Pacific Logging Congress, the trade body of Pacific Coast operators, adopted a standard whistle signal code for coast operations. Distinct sequences of blasts for go ahead, for slack the main line, for slack the haulback, for stop, and, in a category of its own, the signal that meant a man was hurt. Every man on the side had to know the code of the operation he was working, because the sequence of actions, set the chokers, get in the clear, signal, pull, was closely orchestrated precisely because a mistake inside it was not recoverable. A turn of logs breaking out of its bed does not pause. A log snagging a stump at speed can pivot, upend, or roll, and the choker setter's protection was not equipment. Most of these men worked without hard hats, which did not become standard until decades later. But position, uphill, behind the turn, out of the line the cables would sweep if something let go. Consider what this arrangement actually was. The most powerful machine in the woods, applying tens of thousands of pounds of pull through steel lines strung across a slope where a dozen men were working, and the entire safety architecture between them was a wire, a whistle, and the attention span of a 14-year-old. The published oral histories of Northwest logging are consistent on this point. Crews took the whistle punk seriously and rode him hard, because a lazy or distracted punk was a mechanism for killing choker setters. It was the cheapest job in the camp and one of the least forgiving of error, and many of the men who later ran donkeys or rigged spar trees had started on the wire, learning the choreography of a yarding side from the one position that could see all of it. The whistle told Haugen when to pull. It could not tell him how. 3 blasts meant the log was coming, but whether it came sliding or hung up behind a stump with the main line tightening toward its breaking strain was communicated by nothing except the machine itself. What, exactly, did 11 years teach a donkey engineer to feel through a lever? What 11 years taught a donkey engineer was a language with no words in it. The machine reported everything that happened at the far end of the line, but it reported it as vibration, as sound, as the rate at which the drum took cable. A log moving free came in with a particular rhythm, the main line dipping and rising as the load slid over ground, the engine's exhaust steady, the drum winding evenly. A log that had nosed into a stump reported differently, and fast. The drum's rhythm broke, the engine note deepened as the load stopped taking cable, and the main line came up off the ground and went straight. A line under rising strain visibly loses its sag, and an experienced engineer read the sag of his lines the way a sailor reads water. That was the moment the job actually consisted of. Steel cable of this era had a breaking strain, and the safe working load was a fraction of it. A hung-up log with full steam behind it could take a line past that limit in seconds. The engineer's options were all in his two hands: ease the throttle, slack off, and whistle the crew to go see what the log had fetched up against, or feed it more steam and try to walk the log over the obstruction, betting that the load would break free before the rigging did. The first choice cost time, and time was the entire economics of a yarding side. The second choice, wrongly made, sent a broken line whipping back across a slope where his crew was standing. The published record of Pacific Coast logging in this era is blunt about what parted lines and shifting turns did to rigging crews. It is a large part of why Prouty could title the industry's history "More Deadly Than War" without exaggeration. And every engineer worked inside that arithmetic all day. Production against tension, 10 hours a shift, turn after turn. This is what separates the donkey engineer from the folk image of the era. He was not performing strength, the boiler had the strength. He was performing restraint, at speed, on partial information, deciding, dozens of times a day, exactly how much of the machine's power it was safe to use in this second, on this log, with these men in these positions. Regional oral histories describe veteran punchers who could tell from the engine's exhaust alone whether a green choker setter had set a bad choker. Nobody taught that in words. It accumulated, the way Emil Larsson's undercut judgment accumulated, through near misses survived and paid attention to. And all of it assumed one thing, that the machine itself was on the engineer's side. Haugen stood 10 hours a day within arm's reach of a wood-fired boiler carrying working pressure, on a sled in the middle of a forest of drying slash. What happened when the danger stopped coming down the line and started coming from the iron he was standing on? The steam donkey carried two dangers that had nothing to do with the log on the line, and both came from the machine itself. The first was pressure. A donkey's boiler was a riveted iron vessel run at working pressure, fired hard all day to keep steam up for the drums, fed with water piped or hauled from the nearest creek, and maintained in the field, in the mud, by the crew that ran it. A boiler with a low water level, a fouled gauge, or a weakened seam was a bomb the engineer stood beside for 10 hours a shift, and the era's industrial record, in logging as on the steamboats and traction engines that shared the same technology, documents boiler explosions as among the deadliest failures steam power produced. The engineer and fireman lived closest to that possibility. Keeping the water where it belonged and the fire matched to the work was not housekeeping. It was survival, and it was theirs to manage every hour the machine ran. The second danger left the machine and entered the forest. From the 1890s into the 1920s, most donkeys were wood-fired, and a wood-fired boiler working hard threw sparks into slash that a logging operation manufactured by the acre and that late summer dried into fuel. Spark arresters on the stacks helped. Shutdowns in fire weather helped. None of it made the risk zero. The Pacific Northwest's fire history carries the proof of what logging operations could ignite. In August 1933, a fire that began at a logging operation in Oregon's Coast Range burned for 11 days across some 267,000 acres, the first of the fires known as the Tillamook Burn. A machine that had made the forest reachable could, in one dry afternoon, remove it from reach permanently, along with the camp, the rigging, and any man on the wrong side of the wind. So a yarding side in 1923 was a working arrangement among three kinds of hazard: the load, the line, and the fire in the iron. The engineer managed all three at once, and the industry accepted the arrangement year after year. Which raises the question the whole era turns on: why? What was the steam donkey actually worth? In logs? In board feet? In dollars? That made a boiler on a sled in a tinder-dry cut worth running at all. Before you can understand why a company ran a boiler in a tinderbox, you need to understand what the terrain of the Pacific Northwest meant for a crew like Haugen's, and what the country on the other side of the mountains was asking of it. The finest saw timber on the continent stood on ground that punished every earlier method. Douglas fir of enormous size grew on slopes, in ravines, above rivers too small to drive, miles from tidewater. Under animal power, that timber had no price, because it had no route to a mill. The steam donkey gave it a route, a machine that could winch itself up a mountainside on its own sled, anchor, and then pull logs a mile through country no ox could stand up in. Did not just speed logging up. It converted standing forests from scenery into inventory. The numbers of the era show the scale of the conversion. Oregon's annual lumber production, under 1 billion board feet in the 1880s, passed 4 billion by the 1920s. Washington cut around 7 billion board feet a year through the late 1920s, feeding markets from California to the Atlantic and across the Pacific. A donkey cost a company roughly $7,500, and it repaid that price in production. It did not tire, did not founder in mud or ice, and worked in weather that would have killed a bull team's schedule. Regional company records for comparable operations in this decade document camps organized entirely around the machine's output, the railroad laid to the donkey's reach, the felling crews working ahead of it, the whole side paced by how fast the drums could turn. And that is the honest answer to why the risks were accepted. The boiler in the slash, the boy on the wire, the lines run near their limits. These were not oversights. They were the operating costs of an arithmetic in which every day of steam moved timber that a generation earlier could not have been sold at any price. The men absorbed the risk, the country absorbed the lumber, which leaves the other half of the ledger. 7 billion board feet a year did not vanish into statistics. Where did it go? And what, exactly, did the logs coming in past Carl Haugen's drums turn into once they left the mountains? Follow one of Haugen's logs out of the mountains, and you follow the material history of the country. Down the rail line to the log dump, into the boom, through the mill, and out the other side as dimension lumber, railroad ties, bridge timbers, shingles, ship planking, and box shooks. Northwest fir framed the houses of a nation in the middle of a building boom. It went under the rails of the roads that were still expanding. It went into the docks, warehouses, and factories of industrial cities. During the First World War, Olympic Peninsula spruce had gone into aircraft. The people living inside all of it almost never thought about where it came from. That was, in a sense, the measure of the system working. Lumber arrived, cheap and endless, and the mountainside where a 14-year-old had stood in the rain holding a whistle wire was nowhere in the price. Here is the thing worth saying plainly. Carl Haugen had not come to the Cascades to build anyone's idea of the frontier. He had come to run an engine, to make, dozens of times a day, one correct decision about how much of a boiler's power to put into a line strung across a slope full of men, using a judgment built turn by turn over 11 years that no operating manual could substitute for. None of it was heroic in the way the postcards made it look, and none of it was recklessness either. It was a trade, practiced with precision, by a man who understood exactly what getting it wrong would cost, and whose daily output was quietly becoming the floor joists of houses he would never see, in cities he would never visit. That was the equilibrium of the 1920s. Steam, wire, whistle codes, and accumulated judgment, cutting 7 billion board feet a year in Washington alone. At a human cost, the industry's own records kept honestly and reduced slowly. It looked permanent. It looked like the way logging simply was. Then, in the early 1930s, two things arrived in the camps at almost the same time. One was the worst economic collapse in the industry's history. The other was a machine that did not need water, did not throw sparks, and did not need Carl Haugen's kind of fire. What did the diesel engine actually change, and how fast? The change came in stages, and each stage removed one piece of what the steam donkey had required. The first substitution happened inside the machine itself. Converting donkeys from wood to oil firing eliminated the woodbuck and the fireman from the crew. 2 wages gone, and most of the sparks with them. The second substitution replaced the boiler entirely. Internal combustion yarders and crawler tractors, diesel and gasoline machines that had been maturing through the 1920s, offered a plain list of advantages the steam machine could not answer. No water to pipe in from a creek, no fire to raise an hour before the shift, and bank after it. Better fuel economy, and a fraction of the fire hazard in a dry August cut. By the late 1930s, the industry's own trade record is unambiguous. The internal combustion engine had spelled the end of steam in the woods. New steam donkeys stopped being built. Existing ones worked out their settings and were not replaced. The Second World War stretched the changeover. Rationing and war production kept some steam machines working for lack of anything new to buy. But the direction never reversed. And after 1945, the conversion finished quickly. Notice what was and wasn't lost. Yarding did not disappear. Cables, spar rigging, chokers, and whistle signals all carried forward onto diesel yarders, and setting chokers remained one of the most dangerous jobs in America. What disappeared was a specific layer of the engineer's craft. A diesel yarder still demanded judgment about loads and lines, but it no longer demanded the boiler sense, the water, the fire, the pressure, the constant background management of a machine that could kill its own crew while standing still. Steam engineers in their 40s and 50s either learned the new machines, moved to the mills, or aged out with the equipment they knew. Published oral histories from loggers of this period describe, for comparable crews, men who could tell a boiler's condition by ear finding, within a decade, that nobody was asking. The machines themselves faced a simpler economics. A donkey that had winched itself into a remote setting weighed many tons and was worth, by 1940, roughly its scrap value minus the enormous cost of getting it out. For a great number of them, that arithmetic had only one answer. So the question the whole story ends on is a physical one. What happened to the machines that were never worth bringing home? They stayed where they stopped. Across the Pacific Northwest today, up abandoned rail grades in the Cascades, in second-growth timber on the Olympic Peninsula, beside overgrown settings in the Redwood Country, and as far away as a Colorado trailside, steam donkeys still sit where their last turn ended. Boilers rust brown, sleds rotted out from under them, alder and hemlock grown up through the drum frames. A few have been recovered and restored by logging museums. Very few will ever run again. The rest are simply there, several tons of riveted iron in the middle of nowhere, each one marking a spot where, for a few working seasons, a crew of men and a boy with a wire brought a mountainside's timber down to a landing, and the exact economic moment when it stopped being worth anyone's while to come back for the machine. If this channel is going to keep documenting what it actually took to log an American forest by hand and by steam, subscribe. There are more falling crews, more steam donkeys, more logging railroads, and more river drives that quietly built the houses, the towns, and the railroads of a growing country, and were never described as historically significant at the time, because the men doing the work didn't have time to think of it that way. A steam donkey could outpull 200 oxen, but every ton of that pull was applied sight unseen, by one man's judgment, on the word of a whistle, and that judgment is what these rusting machines were built around. And if you have a connection, a relative who ran a donkey, set chokers, fired a boiler, or pulled a whistle wire, put it in the comments. Did they ever tell you what a straining main line sounded like the moment before the engineer eased off? In a coming video, the whistle punk, the boy on the wire who decided, several times an hour, whether the men in the slash lived through the next turn. Carl Haugen's work as a steam donkey engineer ended, in its original form, in 1937, when his camp converted its last side to a diesel yarder. By 1946, steam was gone from the woods he had worked. What the diesel gave the trade: no boiler to fire, no water to pipe, no sparks in an August cut, fewer men on the machine, and more logs at the landing per day. What it did not give anyone: a reason to know what a wood-fired boiler sounds like when the water is right, or what a mainline sag says about a log nobody can see. Carl Haugen did not know this was what 11 years at the levers had built in him. He knew it the first morning the diesel started with the turn of a switch, in the time it had once taken him to lay a fire. The straining line had known what to ask of him. No one had thought to tell the machine to ask.